Hello everyone and welcome to today's HR advice webinar, Disciplinary Cases, Reasonable Responses, Managing Evidence and Anonymous Witnesses. Now to get us started, I am just going to run through a little bit of housekeeping just so you know how everything works in today's session. But on the current slide, you'll see some controls and these will appear on your screen too. If you click the little speech bubble with the question mark, that will open up the Q&A panel for you. Now, in here, you can type in any questions that you've got at any time during the session, ready for the Q&A later on, and we will be answering some of those questions live. Now, just to let you know, if we don't have time to pick up your question, don't worry, we will be reaching out with answers to any unanswered questions after the session. We've also provided a couple of handouts for you. There's a full colour version, so digital version, and a black and white printer friendly version today as well. That will include all of the slides and information that we go through in today's webinar. And you can download these by clicking the little piece of paper with the paperclip icon there just next to the Q&A panel. And that is everything really you'll need for today's session. So now let's meet our speakers. So my name's Alice and I'm a learning facilitator here at Sage. I deliver a lot of the webinars on a variety of products. You might have seen me if you've attended any of the Sage 50 Payroll or Sage HR webinars, but I'm joined today by Advisor Plus's Jack Jones and Nicola Fraser to share their expertise and advice on today's topics. So Jack, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Of course. Hi there, my name is Jack. I've worked in HR for over 7 years, working mainly supporting large organisations within the UK holiday homes and resorts, aviation, utilities, plumbing and heating and renewable energy industries. I have completed my levels 3 and 5 CIPD qualifications and I've worked for Advisor Plus nearing 3 years now. My role as HR business partner means that I have experience working in complex HR topics such as grievance, disciplinary, capability, flexible working, and many others. Nicola, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everybody. My name is Nicola. I'm a senior HR advisor and I have completed my level 5 CIPD qualification in 2024. I have worked for Advisor Plus for almost 4 years, providing HR advisory support to various clients from both public to private sectors. During my career, I have gained extensive experience and knowledge on how to deal with complex disciplinaries, grievances, flexible working requests, attendant management cases, and many others to try and minimize risks to businesses, their employees, and stakeholders.
Great, thank you both. And then just before we get going, I just want to go over the contents of today's session too. So Jack and Nicola are going to be going through quite a lot today. What is a reasonable response in a disciplinary case? The importance of process, fairness and judgment, gathering and assessing evidence effectively, common investigation mistakes to avoid, managing anonymous witnesses and confidentiality, and also tribunal insights, practical tips and key takeaways. So lots to get through, so without further ado, we will get going. And I want to just start by talking about reasonable responses and what is reasonable.
Sure. So first, let's start with what reasonable is not, and that is not necessarily the perfect response. So there may not be a perfect response. A reasonable answer can have trade-offs or uncertainty. For example, choosing a project management tool, several options may work well, none are objectively perfect. Not necessarily the response everyone agrees with. So reasonableness allows for different values, priorities, and interpretations. For example, one manager might prioritize speed and another quality. Both recommendations could be reasonable. A response that falls within a range of reasonable options. So a minority view can still be reasonable if supported by evidence and logic. Conversely, a popular opinion is not automatically reasonable. Now, let's talk about a range of reasonable responses, starting with different investigators who may reach different conclusions. Investigations frequently involve incomplete evidence, conflicting witness accounts, ambiguous facts, judgments about credibility, and interpretation of policies or standards. Two competent investigators may place different weight on pieces of evidence, assess witness reliability differently, or draw different inferences from the same facts. For example, a workplace investigation finds employee A says that a comment was a joke, employee B says it was offensive, and witnesses provide mixed accounts. One investigator might conclude that the allegation is substantiated on the balance of probabilities, whereas another might conclude the evidence is insufficient to substantiate the allegation. Both conclusions could potentially be reasonable if each investigator considered all relevant evidence, applied the correct standard of proof, and explained their reasoning. The mere existence of disagreement does not automatically mean that one investigator was unreasonable. Next, decision makers are allowed discretion. Discretion is the authority to make a judgment or choice within defined boundaries. It means that a decision maker is not required to reach a predetermined outcome, can weigh factors differently, can choose among multiple legitimate options, or is expected to exercise professional judgment. So many decisions involve questions that cannot be answered mechanically. For example, how credible is a witness? How serious was the misconduct? How much weight should be given to mitigating circumstances? What sanction is appropriate? And how much risk is acceptable? The law, regulatory systems, and organizational procedures often recognize this reality by allowing a range of acceptable outcomes. Discretion is usually constrained by policies, procedures, evidence, fairness, consistency, proportionality, and relevant legal obligations. A common misunderstanding is that discretion means a decision maker can do whatever they want, and it does not. A useful way to think about discretion is a band rather than a single point. Managers could create a table, for example, having the headers of reasonable and unreasonable, and placing the information that they have obtained within the table to help balance or weigh up their findings. And finally, the focus is often on process as much as it is on outcome. When talking about reasonable responses, one of the most important ideas is that the quality of the decision-making process can matter just as much as the outcome itself. This is because in many investigations, disciplinary cases, complaints, regulatory decisions, and professional judgment, there is often no single correct answer. What matters is whether the decision maker arrived at their conclusion through a fair, rational, and defensible process. If a decision is judged solely by its outcome, there is a risk of applying hindsight. For example, a decision may turn out to be wrong because new evidence later emerges. That does not necessarily mean it was unreasonable when it was made. Conversely, a decision may turn out to be correct by chance despite a poor process. A decision is more likely to fall within the range of reasonable responses when the process includes gathering relevant evidence, interviewing appropriate witnesses, considering completing explanations, testing assumptions, following applicable procedures, applying the correct standard, and recording reasons for conclusions. Process and outcome work together, and the strongest decisions are those where the process is fair, thorough, and rational, the outcome is supported by the evidence, and the reasoning is clearly explained. A useful way to think about this is like the table I mentioned earlier, a column for reasonable and another for unreasonable. This is why, when assessing whether a decision falls within the range of reasonable responses, reviewers frequently spend as much time examining how the decision was reached as the time they do examining what decision was reached. Now, employment tribunal. The term reasonable response in UK employment law is legally defined by the overview of the range of reasonable responses test. It dictates that an employment tribunal will not substitute its own moral judgment, but rather ask, did the employer's disciplinary decision and procedure fall within a band of reasonable responses that a fair employer might have adopted? The following actual case studies demonstrate how tribunals apply this legal test in practice, starting with Donovan versus Greggs plc. So, the situation. A long-serving bakery employee with 11 years service breached strict food safety and hygiene rules by failing to wash their hands. The employer's response, they had a zero-tolerance policy for hygiene breaches due to severe public health risks and summarily dismissed them. The tribunal outcome was that they upheld the dismissal as fair. Even though the employee had a long, embellished record, the serious nature of the risk and the employer's clear, well-communicated policy meant that dismissal was a reasonable response that the employer could make. Another case, Game Retail Limited versus Laws. So, the situation. An employee posted a controversial tweet on their personal phone outside of working hours and for private purposes. The employer dismissed them for gross misconduct. The employer's response? They dismissed the employee for gross misconduct on the grounds that the company's reputation was put at risk. The tribunal outcome was that they initially ruled the dismissal unfair because the disciplinary policy did not explicitly state that private social media use could be treated as gross misconduct. On appeal, so Game Retail Limited appealed the Employment Tribunal's findings, the Employment Appeal Tribunal acknowledged that dismissal could be reasonable if the employee made no effort to ensure that their tweets only reached a private audience, sending the case back to a new tribunal for review to exactly how they used their account. It demonstrated that an employer must explicitly warn employees in their conduct policies about social media liabilities.
Thanks, Jack. Some really great examples there too. I just wanted to move on to managing evidence though. So how can managers do this effectively?
Okay, so in order to manage the evidence effectively, we need to first understand the matters that we are potentially investigating or gathering evidence for. This means that we need to first and foremost ask right questions. For example, what matters are we trying to resolve? How serious are the matters or conduct? And what consequences and risks it poses to businesses, their employees, and stakeholders? What type of evidence needs to be gathered and what evidence is actually available? Then we gather all of the available evidence, evaluate it, and make informed decisions based on the information gathered. There are some principles of evidence management that can include fairness, which is the key of evidence being considered fair, is to gather as much information as possible and ensuring that evidence gathered is reasonable and gathered from both sides of perspectives, meaning gathering evidence not just that corroborates the matters or conduct, but also the one that is against it. Transparency. The evidence needs to be clear, accessible, and easily understood. Objectivity. The evidence collected should be free of any bias towards any part, meaning it needs to be based on facts rather than opinions, feelings, or assumptions and guesses. Relevance. The evidence gathered must directly relate to the incident or allegations in question to ensure it's not misleading. Think of it in legal terms. In a court of law, evidence is presented in a variety of forms, from eyewitness testimonies and witness statements to forensic evidence and security camera images. All this evidence helps the judge or jury to decide whether a person is innocent or guilty. The same is true for management decisions. Regardless of its source, all evidence may be included if it's judged to be trustworthy and relevant. There are different types of evidence that can be gathered. Some of the examples could be following. Documentary evidence. This could be training records, one-to-one meeting notes, hearing notes, informal documented discussions, letters of concerns, and others. Digital evidence as emails, messages, call logs, photos of pictures, social media posts, computer records like history, visitor URLs, spreadsheets, signed PDFs, Microsoft Words, etc. GPS data of location pings, CCTV recording, voice recordings, and phone recordings. Then we've got witness evidence, which could include witness statements. Physical evidence, which could be a handwritten note, damaged company property, inappropriate drawings, or others. And then we've got circumstantial evidence. This could be evidence that imply indirectly something have occurred. For example, record of attendance, clock-ins and clock-outs, CCTV, vehicle trackers that would imply the employee was at the scene, or for example, unexplained discrepancies in financial reports, history of patterns of behaviors, and many others. This type of evidence is always evaluated on balance of probabilities and reasonable belief. Throughout the process, you can gather evidence before or also after the investigation with the individual, and this is very dependent on the circumstances and nature of the case. That is why planning the investigation, its timeline, and order of events is very important, as is the employers do not carry reasonable investigation. Any decision made could likely be unfair during the formal disciplinary or grievance process and could lead to risk of legal action. Having clear plan can help to make these processes as fast as possible, make it clear on what is exactly needed to be done, ensures the process is full and fair, and it also can maintain good working relationships. First, establish what has occurred and what policy or process is it breaching. How serious is it? Is it gross misconduct allegation or just conduct allegation? Can it be resolved informally in minor conduct breaches first, or is a full-on investigation process required? Are you going to be the one completing the investigation, or does somebody more independent needs to be assigned to avoid conflict of interest? Ideally, person completing the investigation should have appropriate training also. Then it's important to let employee know about the investigation in some way, either by letter or verbally, unless you believe there is a risk that employee could tamper with the evidence or start influencing the witnesses. Then identifying sources, who and what these might be, is the next step. Who were the witnesses present and need to be spoken to? Has anybody been specifically named? As per rota or CCTV, can it be established who was in a vicinity? As we discussed previously, ensure you review what all data and evidence you have available and cover as much ground as possible. Ensure you are aware of the time limits and certain data, as some CCTV, for example, erases after certain periods of the time, the same as reports. Check also policies, procedures, and guides and handbooks if these are available. Preserving records and confidentiality and avoiding contamination. Preserving records and keeping written online copy is very important to avoid needing to redo the investigation and with it any unnecessary delays. Documentation should be also stored appropriately, as it's highly confidential information and should not be left unattended, for example, on the desks, where other individuals have access to. It is important to reiterate to witnesses the confidentiality part to ensure that the investigations and its processes are not discussed between witnesses, as this can have negative impact on the process and the information gathered, as they can be skewed or influenced. Keeping matters confidential can also maintain good working relationships, as employees can feel they can come to yourself in confidence. However, employees should always be made aware that their statement could be used as evidence, and I would always advise confirming with them if they agree with it to be used or shared or not. Even when anonymized, the individual may determine from the circumstances who the witness was. Also, employees should be allowed to discuss the investigations with the trade union and workplace representative. When accessing the evidence, the key considerations are reliability. Are those sources, data, statements factual and accurate, meaning they weren't altered or just hearsay, but actual direct statement of knowledge? As reliance on a hearsay rather than direct primary evidence could lead to making incorrect findings and then decisions. Next one is credibility. Are those sources credible? For example, the witness statements are not shaped by any motive or past conduct and relations. This is again important to evaluate, to focus on a fact-based evidence rather than evidence that is motive-led, as it can misrepresent the fact and evidence and lead to incorrect decisions and processes. Consistency. Is the witness statement staying same across multiple interviews, or is the story changing? Is it aligning with undisputed facts like data, CCTV, and others? Inconsistencies that highlight gaps should always be further questioned and investigated. Please mind that lack of memory not always indicate lack of credibility of the source, as we need to also take into account psychological impact as trauma, for example, or any underlying health conditions. Next one, corroboration. Are there any other evidence that corroborates and verify the witness statements, for example, timestamp, log, CCTV, another independent witness? This can significantly move the case from being word against the word case to more factually proven or disproven. When gathering evidence, there are common pitfalls to be aware of, as it could directly impact the fairness of decisions made and can expose business to risks of legal ramifications. Understanding them ensures that your process is fair, objective, and compliant with UK law and ACAS Code of Best Practice. First of all, confirmation bias can be unconscious behavior where you remember and interpret information based on your preconceived opinions and previous personal experiences. Please be mindful that personal judgment alone is not always a reliable source of evidence, as prone to these cognitive biases and can lead to making decisions that could be considered unfair, discriminatory, or fraud. Ignoring contradictory evidence. The act of dismissing, minimizing, and ignoring evidence like witness statements, data that directly contradicts the other evidence or your theory is important not to be ignored, as sometimes it could mean that no right questions were asked to fully explore the circumstances or conduct. Fully explore and probe further differing evidence or statements, as not doing so may lead to investigations to be more one-sided and not considered from both aspects, which could lead to unfair processes and decisions if moved to hearings, like, for example, unfair dismissals at tribunals. Over-reliance on a single witness. He said, she said situations are notoriously unreliable on their own. Relying on a single voice frequently leads to erroneous conclusions and opens the company up to lawsuits because the accused cannot properly challenge unverified evidence. That's why it's important to gather and corroborate the story or circumstances with other sources also to ensure decisions aren't solely based on entirely one person's account. Failing to document decision making. When making decisions, it is very important to fully explain your rationale behind it. This is not just document why you made the decision, but also what everything has been completed, gathered, and considered as part of that process. This clearly showcases process followed and evidence gathered and weighed. Missing of these written clear steps taken at tribunal, it could lead to tribunal suggesting that the process was flawed, biased, and it destroys credibility of the case. Some practical tips could be, for example, evidence logs or spreadsheets. It's always good to keep an audit or list of evidence gathered and evidence not gathered, why it is reasons why it wasn't gathered. For example, witnesses that left the business or many others. This can always help when reviewing and creating your rationale behind decision, as it shows what everything was considered when making it. Investigation plans. For example, drafting an investigation report. When completing investigation report, you should always consider who will read the report when it's completed. An investigation report should include which facts were established, which facts were not established, and whether there were any mitigating circumstances that also need considering. Report should be objective, avoiding any jargon, and explain acronyms, sticking to the fact and evidence gathered. Concise and include all of the evidence collected, and also articulate if there is any formal or informal actions to be taken. If your business doesn't have a great template, you can also locate one on ACAS page. Decision records, for example, rationale decision-making form. This form can be standalone and also merged with the report for investigation. It's important to articulate your rationale behind your decision and what everything was considered when making it, and why some was not considered, if applicable. As your meeting notes not necessarily document your rationale behind the decision, it is important that some written evidence is completed, especially if cases could potentially lead to tribunals, as it could make the case vulnerable and hard to defend against.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Really, really useful information and tips in there. I do just want to move on to like anonymous evidence and things though. So what happens if a witness wishes to remain anonymous?
Okay, so let's first discuss the risks of anonymous evidence. So anonymous evidence could cause fairness concerns. So anonymous evidence can limit this because the source of the allegation is concealed. The person responding may not know the context, or important details that could explain the evidence may be unavailable. Reduced ability to challenge evidence. So normally evidence can be tested by questioning inconsistencies, comparing accounts, and challenging accuracy. Being anonymous makes this more difficult. Perception of bias. So the person affected may feel the process lacks transparency, or they were unable to defend themselves properly. and difficulty assessing credibility. So decision makers will assess factors such as consistency, plausibility, detail. However, anonymous evidence can make these assessments more difficult. So, what are the key questions before granting anonymity? Is anonymity generally necessary? A mere preference may not be enough. Is there a genuine and identifiable reason? What evidence supports that need? So look for information that supports the claimed need for protection. For example, are there any documentary threats or history of conflict? Are there any alternatives? So possible alternatives can include confidentiality during the investigation. However, this may not be guaranteed indefinitely. Limited disclosure to certain individuals or protective instructions to participants. And can the evidence be corroborated? Are there other forms of evidence, for example, emails, CCTV footage, etc.? When the evidence is anonymous, it may be difficult to assess credibility, motive, or reliability, and consistency. So, how do you manage anonymous evidence? So, good practice would be to record the reasons for anonymity, test credibility carefully, seek corroboration where possible, provide as much detail as fairness allows, and explain decision making. An example scenario. So, an employee witnesses a senior manager falsifying safety records and reports to its investigators. The employee asks to remain anonymous because they fear retaliation, loss of employment, and harassment if their identity is disclosed. These concerns are reinforced by documented instances of similar behavior in the past, where individuals who raised concerns experienced negative treatment or reprisals. The employee is willing to cooperate fully and provide evidence, but believes anonymity is necessary to protect them from genuine personal and professional risks. Their request is therefore reasonable and justified. Even where anonymity cannot be guaranteed, the request can still be considered reasonable and justified. The witness has genuine concerns about retaliation, harassment, or adverse employment consequences if their identity becomes known. By raising these concerns at the outset, they are seeking appropriate safeguards and transparency about the risks of participating in the investigation. Their willingness to cooperate, despite the possibility that anonymity may not be maintained, demonstrates that their primary concern is personal protection rather than avoiding accountability. Now, appeals or employment tribunal. If a case was to go to appeal or tribunal, decision makers often examine why anonymity was guaranteed and granted, whether this was the result of a reasoned decision rather than an assumption, whether credibility was tested, so looking at how the account was assessed, and as inconsistencies were explored, whether the accused had a fair opportunity to respond, so the employee may not know who made the complaint, but do they know the substance of the allegations so that they can respond, and whether reliance on an anonymous evidence was reasonable, so the decision may be scrutinized more closely.
Perfect. So to summarize and highlight key considerations and takeaways is when reviewing any investigation, consider, was the response reasonable? Was the evidence properly gathered and assessed? Was fairness maintained throughout? If anonymous evidence was used, was it justified and appropriately managed? Can the decision maker explain and evidence their reasoning? The key is not whether a different decision could have been reached, but whether the decision maker acted reasonably. This involves assessing whether the evidence was properly gathered and evaluated, whether fairness was maintained throughout the process, whether any anonymous evidence was genuinely justified and carefully managed, and whether the decision maker can clearly explain and support their conclusions with evidence and documented reasonings. Takeaways. Reasonableness is about process and judgment. In many investigations and decision-making situations, there is not always a single objective correct answer. Instead, what matters is whether the decision maker exercised sound judgment through a fair and rational process. Evidence must be actively managed, not merely collected. An investigator's role is not simply to gather information and place it in a file. Rather, they must actively engage with the evidence throughout the investigation, evaluating it, testing it, reconciling conflicts, identifying gaps, and deciding what weight it should carry. Anonymous witnesses require careful handling and safeguards because anonymous evidence cannot usually be tested in the same way as evidence from identified witnesses. Decision makers must take additional steps to ensure that reliance on it remains fair and reasonable. Documentation is often what ultimately defends a decision. A decision maker may have acted fairly, investigated thoroughly, and exercised sound judgment. However, if those steps are not documented, it can be difficult to demonstrate that they have occurred.
Thank you so much, Nicola, and Jack as well. Some really great information that you've shared. And I just want to say thank you for sharing all of that advice with us today. But that does bring us towards the end of the content. So at this point, for everyone watching, I do just want to mention that everyone who has attended will receive a recording of the webinar in the follow-up email that you'll get. So out of everything that we've gone through, if there is anything that you want to go over again or note down, you will be able to. But throughout the session, there has been a few questions come through in the Q&A. So before we close off the session, I just wondered if we could tackle a few of these together. So I've picked out a couple. The first one that I have is, should every piece of evidence be disclosed?
Okay, I don't mind taking this one. So short answer is no. Not every piece of evidence must necessarily be disclosed. The key question would be whether sufficient information is disclosed to ensure a fair process and allow for that individual to understand and respond to the case against them. So decisions about disclosure may also take into account other factors such as confidentiality, privacy, legal obligations, protection of witnesses, and the use of anonymous evidence, as we've been discussing today. So however, any limitations on disclosure should be justified, proportionate, and consistent with maintaining fairness as well.
Great, thank you, Jack. Next one that I've picked as well is, what weight should be given to hearsay evidence?
Okay, I'll take this one. So there is no fixed weight that must be given to hearsay evidence. The appropriate weight depends on its reliability, relevance, detail, and consistency, and whether it can be corroborated by other evidence. Generally, hearsay evidence may be considered, but is often given greater weight when supported by independent evidence and less weight when it's uncorroborated or cannot be tested.
Thank you, Nicola. I've also got, how should conflicting witnesses' accounts be handled?
I can take this one. So conflicting witness accounts should be actively assessed, not simply recorded side by side. The decision makers should consider consistency, plausibility, cooperation, and credibility, and explain why one account is preferred on what weight is given to each. The aim is to reach a reasoned conclusion based on all available evidence. So don't just assume that all accounts are equally reliable.
Thank you. And then last one that I've picked out for now, this one is, what if the accused already knows who the witness is?
Okay, so if the accused already knows who the witness is, that can reduce but does not remove the fairness issues associated with anonymity. The key question remains whether the accused has sufficient detail about the evidence to understand and respond to the allegation, and whether any anonymity is still justified and fairly managed.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you for all of those answers. Hopefully they were helpful to those of you who've asked them. And I do hope generally you've found it a valuable session today. Just a reminder again about those handouts though, don't forget you can download those by clicking the piece of paper icon. And if we weren't able to answer your question live on the session today, we will be following up with you personally after the session. So keep an eye for a response to any of the unanswered questions. And one last thank you as well to Jack and Nicola for the insight and guidance today. The content that you've put together has been really informative and interesting as well. So yeah, thank you so much for that. But before we finish, just a few things. Further help and things like that. If you would like any more help with anything covered today, please do feel free to check out any of the topics on the Sage HR advice portal. Or if you are a professional or premium customer, you can actually call the advice line where one of the consultants will happily provide any guidance on anything that we've covered today. And then just to let you know about a few other things as well, so Sage HR Advice, that is actually here to just help you navigate and simplify any proposed changes and that kind of ever-changing world of HR. I am actually going to run a poll at this point just to offer you the chance to hear more information or pricing about these products. So let me just get that on your screen for about a minute or so. So I'll launch that poll for you. And that should be coming up on your screen now. And that is just saying, I would like to be contacted with more details and pricing for either Sage HR Advice or Sage HR or both, if you'd like. But as I say, lots of changes in the world of HR, so it might be something that you're keen to look into in a little bit more detail. So I'll give you about a minute or so on that. Just fill out that poll if you would like to know more, and I'll pass on your details just to one of my colleagues who'll be able to reach out and just get in touch and see kind of what you'd like with this. I'll leave that open a little bit longer. Just make sure you select your answer, then click submit. Perfect, just a little bit longer. Fab, and I will end that poll now. Thank you very much for those responses. As I say, one of my colleagues will be getting in touch there if you've responded to that. And lastly, I do just want to let you know about some of the webinars that are upcoming as well. So we do run webinars every week on different things. So Sage 50 Payroll is primarily what I run them for, Sage 50 Accounts, and a lot more as well. So if you do want to take a look at the upcoming sessions, you can go to sage.co.uk/webinars or click the link at the bottom of this page on the handout too. But back to Sage HR Advice, our next webinar in partnership with Advisor Plus is actually on the Employment Rights Act, key updates and what they mean for employers. So a little bit of information on what that will cover. But if you do want to sign up for that, just that little button on the right-hand side of the screen there, you can get yourself signed up for that session. And as always, the webinar is free to attend. But with that, that does bring us to a close today. So thank you so much to everyone joining us. And if you wouldn't mind, just please take a moment to fill out the short survey as you exit the webinar. Just a little bit of feedback on today. We do really appreciate any feedback that you have, and we do take that on board for future sessions. But that does bring us to a close. So from myself, Jack and Nicola, it is goodbye for now.